The jungle had swallowed them whole. Elite soldiers of the Imperial Army trained for glory, reduced to prisoners by enemies they had dismissed as children. They arrived at the gates of American captivity bearing wounds both visible and invisible, carrying the unbearable weight of survival when honor demanded death. Propaganda had prepared them for torture, for brutality that would justify their nation's righteousness. What they found instead was a silence more disturbing than any violence, the calm professionalism of their captors, the clean barracks, the posted regulations that promised dignity to the defeated. Inside the wire fences of camps scattered across American soil, these men, who had once burned villages and marched through conquered territories, faced a revelation more devastating than any battlefield loss. Their enemies fed them, spoke to them in their own language, allowed them to pray, to write letters, to gather in the evening light and remember what it meant to be human. The dissonance shattered everything they had been taught to believe. This is the story of men caught between two impossible truths, the shame of surrender and the inexplicable mercy of those who had every reason to hate them. It is a story not of redemption, for such a word implies earned forgiveness, but of survival in its most fragile form, of days measured not in victories but in small mercies, of faith tested not by deprivation but by kindness that felt like betrayal. The war would end. But for these prisoners, trapped in the suspended time of captivity, peace would remain forever incomplete, a door they could see but never fully walk through. Because how do you reconcile the humanity of your enemy with everything you believed about honor, sacrifice, and the righteousness of your cause? Chapter 1. The Weight of Unexpected Defeat, April 1945. The jungle trails of the Philippines had become a graveyard for certainties, for thousands of Japanese soldiers marching through dense vegetation, confident in their superiority. The war had delivered a lesson written in blood and disbelief. They had called them children, the lean, dark-skinned scouts who moved through the trees like shadows, the Filipino guerrillas barely old enough to shave, the local fighters who seemed to melt into the landscape itself. The Imperial Army had dismissed these defenders as insignificant, unworthy of serious tactical consideration. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we tell real, untold stories of World War II, stories of captivity, faith, and the fragile moments of humanity that history almost forgot. The ambush came at dawn, when the mist still clung to the canopy and visibility shortened to arm's length. Japanese columns, stretched thin along narrow paths, found themselves enveloped by coordinated fire from positions they had never detected. The scouts, many trained by American officers, others fighting for their occupied homeland, employed tactics the Imperial Army had never encountered in its swift victories across Southeast Asia. They knew every stream, every ridge, every clearing. They struck with precision born from intimate knowledge of terrain that foreign invaders could only struggle to comprehend. Sergeant Tanaka, not his real name for the defeated carry their shame nameless, remembered the moment his unit realized they were surrounded. The fire came from above, from concealed positions in trees. It came from the tall grass, from behind fallen logs, from directions that seemed impossible. His commanding officer, a veteran of campaigns in China and Malaya, fell in the first volley. The radio operator died reaching for his equipment. Within minutes, the disciplined column dissolved into scattered groups of men seeking cover, seeking escape, seeking any explanation for how children had orchestrated their destruction. The propaganda broadcast from Tokyo had promised them that Filipinos were grateful subjects of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, that local populations welcomed Japanese liberation from Western colonialism. The reality written across the jungle floor told a different story. These were not subjects. They were enemies who fought with a ferocity born from occupation, from witnessed atrocities, from a determination to reclaim what had been stolen. The scouts who captured the survivors, young men with American weapons and Filipino resolve, regarded their prisoners with an expression Tanaka could not decipher. Not hatred exactly, but something harder, contempt mixed with pity. The captives were herded together in a clearing, their weapons stripped away, their wounded left to bleed while the guerrillas secured the perimeter. Tanaka looked at the faces around him, Soldiers who had believed themselves invincible, now reduced to defeated men awaiting execution, because that was what came next. They all knew it. The code of Bushido was clear. Surrender meant dishonor, and dishonor meant death. They had been taught that capture by the enemy resulted in torture, mutilation, execution. They had seen how their own forces treated prisoners. They expected reciprocity and brutality, but the scouts did not execute them. American officers arrived, accompanied by interpreters whose faces looked Japanese, but whose uniforms bore the insignia of the United States Army. These Nisei, Japanese Americans, spoke in the language of home, but represented the enemy. They processed the prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency. Names recorded, wounds assessed, water provided. Tanaka drank from a canteen offered by a man who looked like his brother and felt something inside himself begin to fracture. The march to the coast took 2 days. Wounded prisoners were carried on stretchers. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were helped to their feet, not beaten. At night they received rice, plain but sufficient, and medical attention for injuries that should have killed them. The Americans posted guards, but the guards did not strike them, did not mock them, did not inflict the casual cruelty that prisoners of war had learned to expect. This absence of violence felt like its own kind of psychological warfare, more unsettling than any beating. When they reached the transport ships, Tanaka looked back at the jungle that had consumed his certainties. Somewhere in those green depths lay the bodies of comrades who had died believing in inevitable victory. He was alive, disgraced, and bound for captivity in America itself, the heart of the enemy empire. What he could not yet imagine was that the real war, the one that would challenge everything he had been taught about honor and humanity, was only beginning. The jungle had defeated his body. America would challenge his soul. Chapter 2. The Voyage to Disbelief. The transport ship cut through the Pacific under a sky that offered no answers. Below deck, in holds converted to temporary prison quarters, hundreds of Japanese soldiers existed in a state of suspended disbelief. Tanaka sat with his back against cold metal, surrounded by men whose eyes reflected the same unresolved question: why were they still alive? The shame of survival pressed down with physical weight, heavier than the tropical heat, more suffocating than the confined spaces. In the Japanese military, surrender was not merely prohibited, it was conceptually impossible. Officers carried sidearms not to fight, but to ensure they would never face capture. Soldiers were indoctrinated from their first day of service: death before dishonor, loyalty unto oblivion. The propaganda posters showed brave warriors choosing glorious death over the humiliation of enemy hands. Yet here they sat, breathing, eating the plain rations provided by American sailors, their hearts still beating in bodies that should have been claimed by battle or suicide. Private Yamamoto, barely 20, had attempted to take his own life on the third night aboard. He had saved a razor blade, hidden it in the hem of his torn uniform. But when he pressed it to his wrist in the darkness, his hands trembled. The American medic who discovered him did not punish him. Instead, the medic, a young man from California who spoke broken Japanese, bandaged his wrist and sat with him until dawn, saying nothing. Yamamoto wept, and the shame of his tears felt worse than the shame of his failure. The interpreters who moved through the holds carried clipboards and questions. They asked about units, about deployments, about tactical information. What shocked the prisoners was not the questioning itself, but the method. There was no torture, no threats, no brutality. The Nisei interrogators, American citizens who looked Japanese but thought American, conducted interviews with patients that felt alien. They offered cigarettes. They listened. When prisoners wept from the psychological weight of their survival, the interrogators simply waited. Tanaka found himself talking. Not about tactics or positions, those seemed irrelevant now, but about his family in Osaka. His father, a teacher who had sent him to war with prayers for an honorable death. His mother, who would never be able to face her neighbors if she learned her son had surrendered. His younger sister, whose letters had stopped coming months ago, lost somewhere in the chaos of bombing campaigns. The interpreter, a man named Sergeant Nakamura who had grown up in Hawaii, listened without judgment. When Tanaka finished speaking, Nakamura simply nodded and moved to the next prisoner. Letters from home, when they came at all during the early days of captivity, carried a poison more deadly than any weapon. Families who learned of surrender, a word that shattered honor across the ocean, wrote with confusion, with shame, with questions that had no answers. Some letters were brief. "Your name is no longer spoken here." Others were longer, describing the destruction of cities, the starvation of civilians, the whispers of neighbors who wondered how a son could choose survival over death. Reading these letters, prisoners understood they had become ghosts to their own families, alive but erased, breathing but dishonored. The ship's daily routine imposed a structure that felt surreal in its normalcy. Prisoners were allowed on deck in groups, supervised but not abused. They received 2 meals a day: rice, vegetables, occasionally fish. The food was plain, institutional, but it was more regular and plentiful than what they had eaten as soldiers in the field. This fact alone sparked whispered conversations in the holds at night. How could the enemy feed its prisoners better than the Imperial Army fed its warriors? The question had no answer that didn't challenge fundamental beliefs. Some prisoners, the ones who had served longest, who had witnessed the most, began to speak of what they had seen in conquered territories. The treatment of Allied prisoners, the brutality toward civilians, the casual cruelty that had become routine. These whispered confessions, shared in darkness among men who had nothing left to lose, carried their own weight. If this was how Japan treated its captives, then the mercy they were experiencing made no sense. It violated every principle of reciprocity, every expectation of wartime conduct. As the transport neared the American coast, a new fear emerged. The prisoners had been told that America was barbaric, that its cities were dens of cruelty, that its people were savage individualists without honor. But if the treatment aboard this ship was a preview, then everything they had been taught was a lie. And if the propaganda was false, then what did that mean about the war itself, about the sacrifices, about the honor they had believed justified everything? These questions had no answers. Not yet. But as the California coastline appeared on the horizon, Tanaka felt something shift inside himself. Not hope exactly, but a terrible curiosity about what kind of captivity awaited men who had been prepared for death, but found themselves, instead, facing life. Chapter 3. Gates of Contradictions. The camp appeared like a mirage through the transport truck's wire mesh windows. Neat rows of barracks, guard towers that watched but did not menace, fences that enclosed without threatening. Tanaka pressed his face close to the metal screen, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he had been taught to expect. American POW camps were supposed to be death factories, places where captured soldiers were worked to death or executed for sport. The propaganda films had shown skeletal prisoners, brutal guards, conditions designed to break both body and spirit. This place looked like a military base, clean, organized, almost mundane in its efficiency. The trucks passed through the main gate, where American guards checked paperwork with the bored competence of men performing routine duty. No one spat at the prisoners, no one struck them. The guards simply directed the trucks to the processing center, where more paperwork awaited. The processing took hours. Each prisoner received a medical examination, the first real medical attention many had received since their capture. American doctors, assisted by Nisei translators, checked for wounds, diseases, infections. They treated injuries without comment, without judgment, with clinical professionalism that seemed divorced from the fact that these were enemy soldiers. Private Yamamoto, whose wrist still bore the marks of his suicide attempt, received fresh bandages and a referral to the camp's psychiatric officer. He stared at the prescription slip as though it were written in an alien language. After medical clearance came the issuing of supplies. Each prisoner received 2 sets of clothing, a blanket, toiletries, eating utensils. An American sergeant, speaking through a Nisei translator, explained the camp regulations. Roll call twice daily, work assignments based on ability, access to recreational facilities, male privileges. The translator read from a posted document, his voice steady. as though reciting rules that prisoners would actually be expected to follow rather than suffer under. The barracks were simple but weatherproof: wooden frames, proper roofs, windows with glass. Each prisoner received a bed, not a mat on the ground, but an actual cot with a mattress. Tanaka sat on his assigned bed and felt the springs beneath him, trying to process this latest contradiction. He had slept on jungle floors, in muddy foxholes, in the cramped holds of transport ships. This was better accommodation than he had known as a soldier fighting for the emperor. The evening meal completed the day's cascade of impossible facts. The prisoners filed into a mess hall where American cooks served rice, vegetables, bread, and tea. The portions were adequate, the quality unremarkable, but the very act of sitting at tables to eat, of using utensils, of being served rather than fought over scraps, felt like a performance in a play whose purpose no one had explained. Around the mess hall, prisoners ate in silence, each man alone with his confusion. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. After the meal, as twilight settled over the camp, some prisoners ventured outside. The guards did not prevent them. The fences remained, the towers stayed manned, but within the camp perimeter there was movement, space, a kind of freedom that made no sense for a prison. In the distance, Tanaka could hear sounds he had not expected: laughter from another barracks, the bounce of a ball, someone singing quietly in Japanese. Sergeant Nakamura, the Nisei interpreter, found Tanaka standing near the fence, staring at the darkening sky. "Difficult, isn't it?" Nakamura said in Japanese. "When the enemy treats you like a human being. When everything you were taught turns out to be a lie." Tanaka said nothing. What could he say? That he had been prepared to die honorably but not to live mercifully? That mercy felt like a weapon more devastating than any bomb. "The Geneva Convention," Nakamura continued, gesturing toward a posted sign that displayed regulations in both English and Japanese. "Your country never ratified it, but mine follows it anyway. You'll be treated as prisoners of war, with dignity, with rights. You'll work, but not as slaves. You'll eat, write letters home, practice your faith if you wish, and when the war ends, you'll go home." The last words landed like a blow. Home. A place that no longer existed for men who had surrendered. A country that would regard them as ghosts, as disgraced spirits who had violated the most sacred duty. Tanaka's hands gripped the fence wire, not to escape, but to steady himself against the weight of impossible futures. That night, lying on his cot in the darkness, Tanaka heard men weeping. Some prayed quietly to ancestors, seeking forgiveness for the unforgivable. Others simply stared at the ceiling, processing the day's revelations. Private Yamamoto, in the cot beside Tanaka's, whispered a question into the darkness. What if we were wrong? About everything? No one answered. Because to answer was to acknowledge a possibility more terrifying than death, that the honor they had been taught to die for was a lie, that the sacrifices had been for nothing, and that the enemy they had been taught to hate was showing them more humanity than their own leaders ever had. The fence stood between them and freedom, but the real prison was internal. The bars were made of propaganda and shame, and no American guard held the key to open them. Chapter 4. Routines of Dissonance. The chapel announcement appeared on the barracks bulletin board on a Tuesday morning, written in both English and Japanese. Religious services available. Buddhist meditation Sundays, 900. Christian services Sundays 1100. Catholic Mass Saturdays 1700. Speak to your block representative to register. Tanaka read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding something fundamental. In a prison camp in enemy territory, they were being offered permission to pray. The first Sunday, only a handful of prisoners attended. They entered the designated building, a simple wooden structure with a cross above the door, as though approaching a trap. Inside, they found an American chaplain, a translator, and a rows of simple benches. The chaplain, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gray at his temples, welcomed them in English that was then rendered into Japanese. He spoke of compassion, of faith that transcended nationality, of a God who saw all human suffering without regard for uniform color. Private Yamamoto attended that first service and left with tears streaming down his face, not because the chaplain's words moved him. He understood perhaps 1 in 3 through the translation, but because no one had stopped him. No one had mocked him. The American guards at the door had simply nodded as he entered and exited, as though prayer were the most natural thing in the world for enemy prisoners. That night he wrote a letter home, one of dozens he would send, most of which would never be answered, describing this impossible mercy. Work assignments began the second week. Prisoners were organized into groups based on ability. Some worked in the camp's vegetable gardens, others in maintenance, still others in the kitchens or laundry. They were paid in camp scrip. Not much, but enough to purchase small luxuries from the camp canteen: candy, cigarettes, toiletries. The very concept of being paid for labor, of having money to spend, created cognitive dissonance that some prisoners simply could not process. In the Imperial Army, soldiers served without question, without expectation of compensation beyond honor and duty. Here, even prisoners had economic agency. The garden work brought Tanaka into contact with American soldiers who supervised without cruelty. A corporal from Iowa showed him, through gestures and broken phrases, how to properly stake tomato plants. A sergeant from Texas shared water during the hot afternoon hours, treating the work detail not as slaves but as laborers doing a necessary job. These small interactions, wordless, practical, stripped of ideology, accumulated like evidence in a trial whose verdict Tanaka did not want to hear. Recreation time was perhaps the most surreal aspect of camp life. In the evenings, after work details and dinner, prisoners had access to a courtyard where sports equipment was available: baseballs, soccer balls, volleyballs. Some of the younger prisoners, the ones who had been conscripted most recently, began to play, tentatively at first as though play itself were a betrayal. Then with increasing enthusiasm, as the familiar rhythms of sport provided escape from the weight of shame and confusion. Tanaka watched from the barrack steps, unable to participate but unable to look away. He saw Private Yamamoto learn to throw an American baseball, laughing, actually laughing, when the sergeant from Texas showed him the proper grip. He saw men who had been prepared to die for the Emperor kicking a soccer ball in the evening light, shouting encouragement to teammates, experiencing moments of joy that felt like betrayals of every soldier still fighting. How could they play while the war continued? How could they laugh while their countrymen died? Mail call brought both connection and devastation. Letters from home were censored by both Japanese and American authorities, arriving with sections blacked out, but even the fragments that remained carried weight. Some families wrote with cautious affection, expressing relief that their sons lived while carefully avoiding the word surrender. Other families did not write at all, and that silence spoke volumes about dishonor and erasure. A few letters were harsh. Your father no longer speaks your name. Your mother prays for the son she lost, not the ghost who wears his face. The camp library, yes, there was a library, contained books in Japanese, classics of literature, technical manuals, even some Buddhist texts. An American librarian, an older woman who volunteered at the camp, helped prisoners select books through a Nisei translator. She treated them with the same professional courtesy she presumably offered to any patron, as though the fact of their being enemy soldiers was irrelevant to their right to read. Tanaka borrowed a volume of poetry one afternoon and spent the evening reading verses about cherry blossoms and impermanence, words written in a Japan that felt more distant than the miles could explain. At night, discussions broke out in the barracks, quiet conversations between men trying to make sense of their circumstances. Some prisoners clung to the propaganda, insisting that this mercy was a trick, that punishment would come eventually, that Americans were simply more sophisticated in their cruelty. Others, the ones who had begun to accept food and kindness and small dignities, argued that perhaps everything they had been taught about the enemy was a lie. These debates never reached resolution, but they revealed the fracturing happening inside each man's conception of honor, duty, and truth. Sergeant Nakamura, making his evening rounds, sometimes joined these discussions. He spoke of growing up in California, of being American and Japanese simultaneously, of the complex identity that the war had forced him to navigate. "You were taught that surrender is dishonor," he told them one night. "But you're alive, and being alive means you have choices. You can spend your captivity hating yourselves, or you can spend it trying to understand what it means to be human on the wrong side of a war you didn't start." Tanaka did not know if he agreed, but lying in his cot in a barracks that was clean and warm and safe, he could not deny that something inside him was changing. The armor of certainty was developing cracks, and through those cracks seeped questions that had no easy answers. Questions about propaganda and truth, about honor and survival, about enemies who fed you and countrymen who erased you. The fence still stood. The war still raged. But inside the wire, in this strange, suspended existence, Tanaka was being forced to confront a possibility more dangerous than any weapon: that mercy was real, that the enemy was human, and that everything he had believed might have been a carefully constructed lie. Chapter 5. The Fracture of Certainty. The letter arrived on a morning in late spring, when the camp's garden plots had begun to show green shoots and the weather had turned temperate. Tanaka recognized his sister's handwriting on the envelope. Careful, precise characters that reminded him of childhood lessons in calligraphy. His hands trembled as he opened it, knowing that whatever words lay inside would carry the weight of judgment from a home that felt increasingly theoretical. "Older brother," the letter began, and the formal address told him everything before he read further. "Father passed during the bombing of our district. Mother survived but does not speak of you. The neighbors ask questions I cannot answer. How does one explain that her son breathes while honorable men have fallen? I do not write this to cause pain, but you must know the truth of what your survival has cost those you left behind." The letter contained more: news of rations, of destroyed neighborhoods, of the grinding daily struggle of civilians enduring a war that showed no signs of ending. But Tanaka could not read past those opening lines. His father was dead, killed by American bombs while his son ate American food in an American camp. Alive and fed and safe. The cognitive dissonance of this reality, grief for his father, gratitude for his own survival, shame for both emotions, created a psychological knot that had no untangling. Private Yamamoto found him sitting alone behind the barracks, the letter crumpled in his fist. Yamamoto said nothing, simply sat beside him in the spring sunshine. Two men bound by shame and survival, and the impossible burden of being alive in captivity. After a long silence, Yamamoto spoke. "My brother died at Iwo Jima. My mother's last letter said he charged an American machine gun position rather than surrender. She wrote that she was proud, that his death honored the family. And you?" Tanaka asked, not looking at his companion. "I am alive," Yamamoto said simply. "I am dishonored, erased, a ghost to my own family. But I am alive and he is dead, and I do not know if honor is worth death." The silence that followed carried the weight of heresy. To question the value of honorable death was to question everything, the entire structure of duty, sacrifice, and meaning that had been drilled into them since childhood. Yet here, in a camp where the enemy fed them and allowed them to pray and treated them with a dignity that contradicted every propaganda lesson, such questions became possible. That evening, Chaplain Morrison, the American minister who conducted the Sunday services, requested to speak with Tanaka through Sergeant Nakamura's translation. They met in the small chapel building, where Morrison offered tea and waited patiently while Tanaka struggled to articulate the chaos inside him. "Your father," Morrison said gently when he understood the situation. "His death is not your fault. War creates impossible choices. You survived. That is not dishonor. That is the human will to live, which is stronger than any ideology." Tanaka wanted to believe him, but belief required abandoning structures of meaning that had sustained him through years of military service, through battles and marches and the grinding misery of war. If survival was not dishonor, then what had all those who chose death achieved? If the enemy could be merciful, then what did that say about his own nation's treatment of prisoners? These questions spiraled through his mind like falling leaves, each one pulling him further from the certainties he had once held. The camp's rhythm continued around his grief. Work details departed for the gardens and kitchens. Prisoners attended religious services, played sports, wrote letters that might never be answered. The American guards maintained their professional distance, not friendly but not cruel, simply present and bureaucratic in their management of captivity. In the evenings, the sound of a baseball striking a glove echoed across the compound, a rhythmic reminder that even in imprisonment, life insisted on continuing. A month after his father's death, Tanaka attended his first religious service. He sat in the back of the chapel, uncertain why he had come, knowing only that the weight of grief and confusion had become unbearable to carry alone. Chaplain Morrison spoke about forgiveness, not the grand, performative forgiveness of nations, but the small daily forgiveness that humans must extend to themselves in order to survive tragedy. The words were translated into Japanese by Sergeant Nakamura, who added his own gentle commentary about the complexity of being human in inhuman times. After the service, several prisoners approached Morrison with questions. Through Nakamura's translation, they asked about American faith, about how Christianity reconciled mercy with war, about whether God could forgive men who had survived when honor demanded death. Morrison answered each question thoughtfully, without judgment, treating their theological struggles as legitimate rather than as the confused babbling of defeated enemies. Walking back to the barracks, Private Yamamoto spoke quietly. "I think the cruelest thing they do to us is treat us well. If they beat us, if they starved us, we could hate them. We could maintain our certainty. But this kindness, it destroys everything we were taught to believe." Tanaka nodded, recognizing the truth in those words. The fence remained. The guards watched. They were still prisoners, still defeated, still men who had surrendered when honor demanded death. But the captivity was not physical. The true prison was the collapse of the worldview that had made sense of suffering, the shattering of propaganda that had sustained meaning. And unlike physical prisons, there was no liberation from this kind of captivity, only the slow, painful reconstruction of understanding in a world where enemies could be merciful and honor could be a lie. That night, Tanaka began writing a letter to his sister, not to explain, explanation was impossible, but to acknowledge. "I am alive," he wrote. "I do not know if this is honor or shame. I know only that each day I breathe, I choose life over the death that was expected of me. Perhaps that is its own kind of courage. Perhaps it is cowardice. I no longer know the difference." He sealed the letter knowing it would be censored, knowing it might never arrive, knowing his sister might not respond. But the act of writing felt like a small act of resistance, not against his captors who treated him with incomprehensible mercy, but against the internal voices that insisted his survival was unforgivable. The war continued somewhere beyond the fences. Men died daily in battles whose outcomes no longer seemed to matter. But here, in this impossible space where the enemy refused to be cruel, Tanaka was learning a harder lesson than any battlefield had taught: how to live with the unbearable weight of mercy. Chapter 6. The Precarious Peace. August 1945 brought rumors that spread through the camp like wind through leaves, whispered in Japanese during work details, discussed in hushed tones during evening recreation, debated in the barracks after lights out. Something had happened, something enormous. The American guards were tense but not hostile, conferring in groups, glancing at the prisoners with expressions that mixed relief and something else, perhaps pity. Sergeant Nakamura gathered the prisoners in the mess hall on a Tuesday afternoon. His face, usually friendly, carried the weight of information that would reshape worlds. "The war's over," he said in Japanese, his voice steady but somber. "Japan has surrendered. The Emperor himself has spoken on the radio, instructing all military forces to lay down their arms." The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the sounds of men breaking, some weeping openly, others sitting in stunned disbelief, a few laughing with the manic edge of those whose minds have finally reached their limit. Tanaka felt nothing at first, as though his capacity for emotional response had been exhausted. Then, slowly, the implications began to settle. The war was over, but he was a prisoner, surrendered before his nation had surrendered, dishonored before dishonor became universal. "You will be going home," Nakamura continued, his translator's voice cutting through the chaos of responses. "Processing will take time, weeks, perhaps months. But you will return to Japan. The war is over. Home." A word that had lost meaning during months of captivity, Tanaka tried to imagine returning to Osaka, to a city he had learned from letters no longer resembled the place he had left. He tried to imagine facing his mother, his sister, his neighbors, faces that would look at him and see not a returning soldier but a man who had surrendered, who had survived when honor demanded death, who had lived in enemy captivity while the nation burned. The days following the announcement brought a strange mood to the camp. Some prisoners celebrated quietly, grateful to be alive and returning home. Others withdrew into silence, processing the complex emotions of relief, grief, and shame. The American guards relaxed their vigilance slightly, though the fences and protocols remained. There was no mass release, no immediate freedom, just the slow bureaucratic machinery of peace grinding toward repatriation. Chaplain Morrison held a special service that Sunday, attended by more prisoners than had ever come before. He spoke through Nakamura's translation about the difficult work of peace, how it required more courage than war, how forgiveness was harder than hatred, how rebuilding was more challenging than destruction. "You will go home to a nation that must reckon with defeat," Morrison said. "You will carry memories of captivity, of treatment that contradicted everything you were taught about your enemies. What you do with those memories, how you choose to remember these months, that will determine what kind of peace your nation builds." Tanaka listened, knowing the chaplain was right and knowing simultaneously that the truth was irrelevant. He would return to a Japan that regarded surrender as unforgivable, that had built its entire war effort on the principle that death was preferable to capture. His survival, his captivity, his experience of enemy mercy, all of it would be shameful secrets to be hidden, not lessons to be shared. The kindness he had experienced would become another weight to carry in silence. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how humanity can survive even inside the walls of captivity. In the final weeks before repatriation, the camp's routine continued, but with a different texture. Prisoners worked their assigned details knowing these would be their last. They attended services, wrote final letters, played sports with a nostalgia for captivity that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Private Yamamoto, who had attempted suicide in the transport ship's hold, who had wept after his first chapel service, who had learned to throw an American baseball, confessed to Tanaka that he was afraid to go home. "Here, I know the rules," Yamamoto said one evening as they watched younger prisoners play volleyball in the compound. "I know I am defeated, dishonored, but everyone here is defeated. At home, I will be surrounded by people who chose death over survival. How do I face them?" Tanaka had no answer. He had wondered the same thing every night since learning of his father's death. The fence had kept them in, but it had also, in a strange way, protected them, created a space where surrender was universal, where shame was collective, where mercy was possible because judgment was suspended. Beyond the fence in the Japan they would return to, no such protection existed. The morning of departure arrived in September, with early autumn colors beginning to show in the trees beyond the camp perimeter. Prisoners lined up with their meager possessions, received final processing paperwork, and boarded the buses that would take them to the port. American guards who had supervised them for months nodded goodbye. Chaplain Morrison stood by the gate, shaking hands with prisoners who had attended his services, offering final blessings in a language most did not understand, but whose meaning transcended words. Sergeant Nakamura found Tanaka before boarding. "What you experienced here," Nakamura said, "the kindness, the mercy, it was not a trick. It was not propaganda. It was simply humans choosing to treat other humans with dignity, even in the context of war. Remember that. When you face the shame and judgment at home, remember that your enemy saw you as human when your own nation taught you to be a weapon." Tanaka bowed, a gesture of respect that felt inadequate for everything Nakamura represented. The bridge between worlds, the translator not just of language but of humanity itself. Then he boarded the bus, taking a seat by the window, watching the camp recede as they drove toward the port and the ships that would carry them across the Pacific to a homeland that might no longer recognize them. The voyage back was nothing like the voyage to captivity. The prisoners traveled in better conditions with adequate food and medical care, treated by American military personnel with the professional courtesy of victors who could afford magnanimity. But the mood among the prisoners was somber, each man alone with his thoughts of what awaited. Some wrote letters to families, trying to prepare them for return. Others stared at the horizon, watching Japan appear as a line of land that promised both relief and reckoning. When the ship docked in Yokohama Harbor, the prisoners saw a nation transformed by defeat. The city bore the scars of bombing, whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, survivors moving through the wreckage with the hollow-eyed expression of those who have endured the unendurable. American occupation forces managed the port, their presence a daily reminder of who had won and who had lost. The prisoners disembarked into a Japan that had surrendered, but they carried with them a different kind of surrender, one that had taught them mercy, humanity, and the unbearable complexity of enemies who refused to be monsters. Tanaka stood on Japanese soil for the first time in over a year, feeling the ground beneath his feet, breathing air that smelled of home and destruction. He had survived the jungle, survived captivity, survived the war. Now came the hardest survival of all, living with the memory of kindness from enemies, with the knowledge that honor might be a lie, with the weight of mercy that his nation would never understand or forgive. The war was over, but peace, true peace, would remain forever out of reach, a fence he could see through but never cross. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden stories of World War II, stories of resilience, memory, and redemption. Thank you for watching. They carried the memory like shrapnel, invisible, permanent, occasionally painful when the weather changed. Years later, in the rebuilt cities of Japan's economic miracle, in the silence of private homes where shame was currency and survival required forgetting, these men would remember the camps, not with fondness. Captivity is never to be desired, but with a confusion that never fully resolved. The enemy had been merciful when mercy made no sense, had seen humanity when propaganda demanded they see only animals, had offered dignity when honor demanded they receive none. Some spoke of it in whispers, late at night to children who did not understand. Others took the memory to their graves, unable to reconcile kindness with defeat, unable to explain that the most devastating weapon America deployed was not the bomb, but the daily choice to treat prisoners as human beings. The war had ended. The peace had begun. But the fence remained, not in any physical space but in the landscape of memory, separating what they had been taught from what they had experienced, keeping them forever in that suspended state between honor and survival. In the precarious balance between memory and forgetting, they found not redemption but something smaller and more human. The quiet acknowledgement that they had lived when death was expected, that survival itself became an act of resistance against the lies they had been taught to die for.